Добрий день. I'll try this. Дуже рада бути в Харкові. Now you're going to have to use your translators. Trust me, I'm practicing. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today in Kharkiv. As so many people have said already, this is a city that is celebrated for so much. It's particularly celebrated, I understand, for its avant-garde art, and it's also avant-garde thinking, especially thinking to deal with civil society and civil society organizations. I hear this is a real hotbed for that. In the world of fine art, the term avant-garde used to describe an artist or a group or a musician or a style that's considered to be significantly ahead of most people in how, what, and for what purpose they create art. So I think it's a real tribute that this forward type of thinking, this breadth of perspective, this willingness to see and to do things differently, that the architect of Ukraine's legal aid system decided to hold this conference here in Kharkiv. It also speaks volumes about the legal aid system's incredibly avant-garde development. And for those of you, maybe a small advertisement, if you haven't already seen this, and I'll just raise a couple of the statistics. The Justice Ministry here in Ukraine, with our legal aid program from Canada, has put together this incredible resource booklet that talks about how this legal aid system has evolved here and the incredible statistics of real cases and real people that it's helping, and I really encourage you to pick this up and to read this. A must read. So a couple of those statistics. From only a head office in Kiev in 2012 to 27 regional offices now delivering criminal legal aid services, and that happened by 2013, to over 100 community legal aid centers and a national call center providing civil and administrative legal services to vulnerable people by 2015. And in place now an additional 400 plus, I think I heard almost 500 plus, points of service established across this country. That's a remarkable achievement, and what a great time at this conference to take stock of Ukraine's legal aid system, where it has been, what it looks like today, where it needs to be tomorrow. That's something that Vivek Maru, Chief Executive Officer for Namati, knows and will share with us later today. His organization's work in Sierra Leone and in India is eloquent testimony to the importance of using legal recourse to supplement community advocacy. It's also something we're going to hear from Nangu Makubela, who I met a little earlier, the director of the National Alliance for the Development of Community Advice Offices in South Africa, an organization that is using legal education to level the playing field between vulnerable individuals and vulnerable groups and their governments. Indeed, all of the presenters assembled here for this important international conference has a compelling story to share. Stories and lessons from the front lines in the battle against discrimination, poverty, corruption, and injustice. Stories from here in Ukraine, from Canada, and from all parts of the world. Stories about how primary and secondary legal aid services are helping people. People like farmers, the handicapped, women, Indigenous people, sex workers, refugees, and internally displaced persons, helping them assert their legal rights, their property rights, their treaty rights, and most important of all, their human rights. Stories from people who are using legal aid as a foundation for building stronger, more resilient, and self-reliant communities. People who are using innovation in governance, in administrative practices, in technology, to make legal aid more accessible and sustainable. It's an impressive roster of presenters and panelists, and I'm very excited to be sitting in on some of these sessions. But it's also a really great time to talk about community and legal empowerment, because increasing the power of ordinary people, like us, to exercise their human and civil rights as individuals or as members of communities It's a means to a greater end. And that means, and I think everyone has been seeing that, it's to a fair and a just society. I'm going to talk about this from two perspectives. First, a personal perspective, and then a professional one. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of community engagement and community empowerment. But the personal perspective for me is important, because what else motivates us to get involved, to work with people, to empower communities and individuals than the people that surround us, that in many ways inform us, and that truly have to motivate us. My personal and professional background has provided me with an appreciation that legal empowerment is not an abstraction. It's a real intangible thing, and it matters. It matters to people on the ground and at the community level because it does two things. It empowers individuals and it enables civil society. And those are the two key building blocks of democracy. For me, empowering individuals and building strong communities has been a guiding force. I profoundly believe in the importance of ensuring people have access to services they need, including legal services, that they know and they understand their rights and can exercise them fully, that they feel safe and secure, and that they can trust those with whom they work and interact. My passion undoubtedly comes from four key people in my life. And first and foremost, they're my parents, who were Polish immigrants who came as displaced persons to Canada after the Second World War. My father fought for the Polish underground against the Russians and the Germans. He was shot and captured during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, and he was interned in a German concentration camp until he was freed by US forces. He came to Canada after spending 2 years in a refugee camp in Europe. He came as an unpaid worker. For 2 years, he provided free labor to build our Canadian Railroad in northern Canada in order to earn his landed immigrant status. Similarly, my mother, at age 15, was taken by Germans from her home just west of Warszawa and served on a labor farm. She too came to Canada as a refugee and became an unpaid worker, once again, at a textile mill in Quebec. They had nothing. They had lost everything and everyone. My parents had no legal or human rights during those years, not even in the first couple of years when they came to Canada. But they did survive and they thrived. My father, however, never really trusted anyone but family. He never wanted to be visible in Canada because he still had that everlasting fear that he was always being watched, of something going wrong. Something that's still too real today for too many people in too many places. But somehow he instilled in me this incredible need to become educated, to go out to the world and understand how things worked, and to work to make things better. I'm one generation away from having nothing, from having no rights. Yet Canada has provided me with the opportunity to rise to the highest levels of community and public service. So, my second major influencer, my husband Paul, was raised like me. He's of Ukrainian descent, whose parents hailed from Ternopil and Rabaruska. Like so many of the over 1 million Canadians of Ukrainian descent, his heart and his shared sense of destiny straddles two continents, Canada and Ukraine. He too is working with reforms in Ukraine, and I can't help but be motivated by his desire to help and his love for both countries. And finally, most relevant, Peter, my cousin. Peter grew up a rebel, a physically and emotionally angry child, perhaps reflecting the post-traumatic stress disorder from which his father suffered. This resulted in his being in juvenile detention at an early age and in jail for too much of his life. Peter wasn't bad, he was just different. And neither the family, nor the community, nor the system knew how to deal with him. What I do know is that the legal aid system came to his aid successfully because now at the age of 62, he is crime-free, and more importantly, he's alive. Peter is why I believe in legal aid and legal empowerment. Perhaps had our family known more about how to help Peter, how to deal with the criminal justice system, Peter would have spent less time there. Those in legal aid who did help him with his charges and his trials in dealing with the police and the courts were the only lifeline he had to lift himself out of drugs and gangs and worse. So today, it is Peter that reminds me of why this conference is so important. The legal aid system built here in Ukraine is critical to ensuring that people like a Peter have recourse and support, and that through the broader community, people like a Peter are supported even before they enter the criminal justice system. Legal aid is not about building a new program. It's not just about lawyers and clients, although they are very important. It's about the fusion of sound, supportive social services and programs in a community with broad educational opportunities and with clear community activities that are geared to empowering individuals. It's about building trust and resiliency in individuals and communities. And above all, it's about ensuring access to justice for all, regardless of people's circumstances. Now, I entered the public service in Canada in the 1980s during a period of growth and social innovation, when there was a real willingness to embrace change and a sense of urgency to achieve social justice, when there was an imperative to build in Canada a just society, as then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of our current Prime Minister, famously said. I hate to say that I actually knew both Prime Ministers. Speaks to my age. I have been working towards that ideal of a just society in a career that has spanned 3 decades in Canada and abroad in both the public sector and the community sector. What has driven me has been the desire to make a difference in people's lives, to work to change programs and services and policies and legislation that was either preventing people from achieving their potential or discriminating against them outright. So each of the examples I am going to be speaking to just now have a why and a how behind them. Why we engaged with community and how we did it. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because I'll be presenting at a session a little later on today. But perhaps through some of these examples, they just might spark a little bit of a thought or maybe an action in you and in your organization. So example 1. As Canada's head of citizenship, I brought together civil society organization to ensure immigrants and new Canadians understood their rights and obligations under our Constitution and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I did similar work with refugees in Australia. In both instances, we engaged community organizations proactively at the very beginning of our work to provide what we would call welcome services to ease the transition of these individuals to their adopted countries. Welcome services that focused not only on their material, social, physical, and economic needs, but also on making them aware of the resources at the community level to protect their rights as citizens. That included trying to ensure that these welcome organizations had a degree of literacy in regards to basic legal rights and protections available to the communities they served, as well as an understanding of how and when to refer them to the legal aid or the justice system. So example 2. As Deputy of Canada's National Police Service, Nasza Kanadacka Policja, known as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we built a robust community engagement strategy that we employed through major events like our first G7 summit. For it, we put police officers on the streets, not wearing flak jackets and carrying machine guns, but on bicycles and in neighborhoods and wearing shorts. We also ensured that we could allow protesters the right to a freedom of speech and the right to assembly without interference. In addition, following 9/11, we built a robust community engagement strategy when we, our police force and members, actively engaged Muslim communities to talk with them, to work with them, to ensure they not feel neglected or afraid, and now we are recruiting from them. The RCMP is a national civilian police force founded upon the principle that the police are the public and the public are the police. Like the Reformed Patrol Police here in Ukraine, we draw our members from the community, ensuring there is a reflection of the community and knowledge of our diverse populations and way of life. The RCMP has embraced community policing as a fundamental way of working. It requires police to work with city councils, NGOs, the justice system, social services, religious groups, business, governmental agencies, to help understand issues in the communities in which they serve. That cooperation and collaboration has been instrumental to building community capacity, to building strong communities, empowering individuals to find justice and the means to enforce it. That's a big shift for a police organization from command and control to engagement and empowerment. Now, I'm going to take a little break, if the translators don't mind, from the script we gave them, and just talk to you about something that's just recently happened in Canada. It doesn't speak to legal aid, but it speaks to legal empowerment. 500 female police officers of Nasza Kanadacka Policja, the RCMP, undertook a class action lawsuit against the organization. It took them 10 years to get this done. It was a lawsuit for sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. 500 female police officers. During the 10 years it took them to get this done, many of the women were bullied, shunned, abused, called traitors by their colleagues and their supervisors. Many lost their jobs, their families, their health, and more than anything else, their dignity. Just a few weeks ago, this case was finally settled, and the women were awarded $100 million in compensation for what had happened to them. And maybe even more importantly, the head of our RCMP, the commissioner, apologized publicly for the misconduct of his members. For that to take 10 years, for that to happen in Canada, but for that to take 10 years to women who are educated, empowered, who work in a police institution that upholds the law, seems to me to make it even more essential and critical and urgent for us to build pathways for individuals who are not educated, who are poor, who are disabled, who are disaffected, and perhaps discriminated against. No one organization or individual can do that. Understanding increases when people from different walks of life and work come together and walk in each other's shoes. That brings down barriers and misunderstandings and prejudices, and it provides more safety in dealing with elements in society that try to erode justice and people's rights. So my final example is walking in other people's shoes. After working with communities and with community organizations for most of my public sector career, I moved into the community sector. And I joined what's called United Way Canada. United Way is Canada's largest social services NGO. We raise over $500 million every year, $500 million every year, from individual donors and workplaces, $1 at a time. We do this to provide funding, research, support, and services to Canadians and their communities. United Way Canada is made up of 100 community self-governed organizations within a national body. And we are also part of a worldwide organization that does this in some 34 countries around the world, including Poland and Hungary, to name a few. We're not yet here in Ukraine. And while we were in Russia, we closed our NGO there 3 years ago because it was not meeting our governance standards that required people in the community to work as heads of these organizations and to have boards that were made of volunteers, nor are there our fundraising standards, which meant that money raised in the community had to go back to the community. We also have a very stringent ethical code of conduct, which might have had something to do with it. United Way is known for work in what's called community capacity building. in building resiliency in individuals and communities by strengthening what I call as social infrastructure and providing people with tools to deal with poverty, unemployment, youth at risk, and other social issues. Each community is unique, and the work we do starts with a very simple premise of knowing the community. Understand what it is, how it works, who is in it, what are its assets, and what are the challenges. Sometimes we lead community conversations, and sometimes we're participants at the table. What matters is that we listen to the community and to the people. We do this to understand their issues and then work to address them by allocating funding and other resources to their priority needs. One of the community assets we just recently innovated, part of that social infrastructure I talk about, is 211, a very simple concept of setting up a phone line with a website behind it that allows people to call it and receive immediate connection to a community service and support subject to what their need is. To make 211 successful, we do two things. First, in order to qualify for 211 in a particular area, we require the provider to complete an inventory of all available social and community service providers, where they are, the services they offer, their hours of operation, so that when someone calls, we can refer them to the closest provider able to meet their immediate need. This allows us to do more than just set up a phone referral service. It allows us to identify major gaps in community social infrastructure, where there is a shortage of immigrant aid services or addiction treatment centers, homeless shelters, mental health services, food banks, home care services for the elderly, and even legal aid clinics. This analysis provides us with what we call an essential roadmap for governments, social service agencies, and other funders to direct the resources to where there's most need, based in part on reviewing the 211 call center data and whether the needs of the callers were being met. Secondly, we provide professional training to those responding to 211 calls so they understand that they have a wider responsibility for and accountability to their clients. We teach them to connect the dots between the complex and interdependent needs of our clients. So if a woman calls 211 to find out how to access legal aid services because she wants to escape an abusive relationship, our operators are trained to do more than simply refer her to legal aid. They are trained first to ask if she has a place to stay somewhere safe, if there are children at home, if she has somewhere to go for that evening. Yes, she might need a lawyer going forward, but the immediate imperative is for her safety and that of her family. Our 211 operators are trained to deal with the individual, not with the issue. I emphasize this because I am aware that the 211 model we developed has influenced some of the thinking about Ukraine Legal Aid, National Call Center, and the 100+ legal aid centers, and I applaud and encourage that initiative. If each of Ukraine's community legal aid centers completes that community inventory of churches offering respite to the poor and hungry, of human rights organizations fighting discrimination, of social service providers helping the unemployed looking for jobs, of NGOs helping internally displaced persons regain their rights, the sick to find hospital beds, the illiterate to access education services, sex trade workers to find an exit strategy. And if each community legal aid center works with these community groups and NGOs and bring them together to discuss issues of mutual interest and concern, and discusses the interface between the legal aid system and the services they provide, and trains them as legal aid champions, equips them to deliver primary legal aid support, to perform critical triage in regards to the clients they refer to legal aid centers, then you'll be doing more than just providing legal aid services to those in need. You will be building a more viable and sustainable social justice system. You'll be helping build a more just society. That, to me, is the true transformational potential of building an effective legal aid system. I know that's a heavy responsibility to assign to a relatively small program, but there is nothing wrong with thinking big, avant-garde, especially when something as important as ensuring access to justice for all is at stake. And that is why my final takeaway for you, you're almost ready for coffee, the culmination of my 30 years of public and community service is distilled down to 3 key messages. First, to be successful, we need to understand and engage civil society organizations early and at every step of the way. We need mutual accountability and mutual respect. And where these organizations cannot yet play that role or do not yet exist, we have to build the right conditions where they can. Second, you are doing more than just building a legal aid system for Ukraine. You're building a stronger and better and more just country. That's the vision and the performance metric to which you and we need to aspire. And third, think big and long-term. Think outside of the box. Have persistence and passion for change. I know it's not always easy, but it is essential. I'm heartened by the incredible progress which Ukraine's legal aid system has already achieved, and I thank Andriy Vishnyevsky for his incredible leadership and commitment. Enjoy these couple of days of learning and sharing. I look forward to meeting many of you at the various sessions. Thank you. Дякую вам за уваги. Бажаю нам всім плідної роботи. Слава Україні!